There's been a lot of discussion in the store in the last few weeks, and some discussion that I've been paying attention to across the Wild Birds Unlimited system in most of the continent. And a lot of people are talking about how few ruby-throated hummingbirds they are seeing now at their feeders. And so I've created this tutorial which digs into eBird to create graphs that help us see fluctuations in hummingbird activities from the historical data in eBird. Now, I've given you a little bit of footage from my own feeder. This is just a couple days ago to show you that, hey, I got a ruby-throated hummingbird and I do see it every day. So check out what I've done here on ebird.org, and hopefully it'll help you make sense of what's going on at your own feeders. First, you want to go to ebird.org. That's ebird.org. And on the home page here, click on Explore Data. Wait, this is the home page. And then click on Explore Data. When you want to look at the way a bird species behaves, its status and distribution throughout the course of a year, then generally the feature that you want to use to explore is bar charts. So I'll click bar charts. We're going to look at Florida. So I'll find Florida in the state list, and then I'll click the radio button for entire region. Come down here and hit continue, and then it pulls up all of the data for all of the avifauna in Florida. I'm going to use the standardized search function in Windows, Control F, type in Ruby, because I'm going to ruby-throated hummingbird, and I find two ruby-throated hummingbirds. One is ruby-throated / black-chinned. We want to look at just ruby-throated hummingbird. So I click on the species name, and that gives me my graph. All right, so here, this graph tells us a lot about what's going on with the hummingbird right now, with the ruby-throated hummingbird in Florida right now. Here you see in the beginning of March, we are at basically just a handful of observations throughout the entire state, maybe on the order of dozens. And then when migration begins, you see a serious uptick where, and finally we reach a first peak around the second week of April, and then it continues peaking into the end of April, and then we have a serious decline in the number of observations here. And what that is that this means that this peak, this double peak right here, represents spring migration. So most of the ruby-throated hummingbirds that are observed in Florida in this time continue moving on through to places further north. And so once that migration begins to wane, we see a fairly significant decrease in the number of hummingbirds that we observe throughout the state. And so here we come down into this trough around the third week of May. Things start picking up a little bit in June when breeding activity gets to the point that young birds begin to fledge from the nest, and then we reach a second set of peaks inside the season. And what this represents is after the fledging period has occurred, the young birds come out and begin to forage on their own, and so observations increase after breeding season results in fledging. And then we have another little bit of a decrease, which I believe represents the dispersal of young birds from the area that they were born in and observed in. So a bit fewer observations from the areas where people are from which they're usually making the reports. But then, of course, let me get the mouse out of the way so you can see that third peak really well, and I'll go back and mouse over it. Here we have in the second and third week of September on into early October, we have the peak of fall migration. That's when we see the greatest number of ruby-throated hummingbirds. And then this long decline as those birds migrate south out of the state almost entirely into the second week of November, third week of November, and on into December and back over here into January, where we have very, very few hummingbirds, but some remaining throughout the winter. Now, there's one more part to this that I want you to observe. Now, over here on the y-axis, you've got to pay attention to really appreciate the scale of observations. if you compare the data on the ruby-throated hummingbird and any other bird, really, from state to state or from region to region, then it's going to be important to not just look at what's happening here on the x-axis, because that's pretty obvious. Through the calendar year, the x-axis, the values on the x-axis are the dates, and so we look here at what's happening throughout the season. But here on the y-axis, the frequency represents the number of reports that come into eBird that contain at least one ruby-throated hummingbird. And here, this number is pretty significant. This means that in Florida, even at the peak of the season, in the fall, at the peak of fall migration, the total number of reports in Florida that contain at least one ruby-throated hummingbird is less than 10%. Now, that's important to note, because if you look at ruby-throated hummingbird observations in another state where there are a lot more ruby-throated hummingbirds, and to do that we would change the location. I'm going to leave all the other values the same, but we're going to change the location by clicking on Florida. Whoops. I actually want to click on change location. Now, let's look at, what did I have? A good one is Missouri. So we'll click on the entire state, continue. It loads the values for all of the avifauna. In Missouri, we're going to find ruby-throated hummingbird again, click on the species name, and see the graphs. There are some peaks and valleys to Missouri, but look at here at the y-axis. The number of reports that contain at least ruby-throated hummingbird in the peak of fall migration is over 35, is near 40%. So remember, Florida in the peak of fall migration, only about 10% of all reports contain at least one ruby-throated hummingbird. Missouri is almost 400% denser in hummingbirds in fall migration and throughout the rest of the year. Now, prior to creating this tutorial, I did a little bit of extra work that I want to show you, and we're not going to go into great detail here, but if you click on download histogram, I'm not going to do it now, but if you click on download histogram, it allows you to export the data that they use to create this graph. And I exported the data from Missouri, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, because when you do that, you can standardize your X and Y axes in Excel. You can import this information into Excel and create graphs in Excel. And when you do that, you can standardize what's on the X and Y axis, because when you go back and forth from state to state, these graphs look deceptively similar. But when you look at them stacked on top of each other in a graph created in Excel, this is what you got. So over here on the y-axis, you'll see the values are less than, well, they go all the way up to, here's that value from, I think that is Louisiana actually. So Louisiana gets even denser in hummingbirds than Missouri. This gray line represents Louisiana, this yellow line Missouri, this blue line, this darker blue line Pennsylvania, and this orange line South Carolina, and down here is Florida. So this gives you a little bit of perspective about just what that graph that we saw back in eBird means relative to those that we produce for other states or other regions. Hope that was clear enough that you can go in and start playing with that and actually have some meaningful data result from it. If not, send me a question and I'll try to talk you through it. Thanks for listening.